Even if you look at Shenzhen, Deng Xiaoping did his famous southern tour, I think in like 92, 93, where he basically needed to build up political support. This was after he retired as premier, but he needed to build up political support to save Shenzhen because the conservative hardliners in the government wanted to basically crack down on Shenzhen. So Deng Xiaoping had to go and do like this whole southern tour to basically be like, look, guys, like this liberalization strategy is working. When you mention the US, like the other question is the US a reliable counterparty? Like, we're seeing a great disruption in activity. Maybe this disruption will take like the end of the Trump admin and there'll be a new normal and everything settles down. Or maybe we'll see this back and forth where they tear down what the other party built and try to build up a new program that has a limited shelf life until the next election.
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Mark Lutter, the director of the Charter Cities Institute. We discuss what makes a good charter city, taking over the Presidio just north of San Francisco, what U.S. aid and foreign development should look like, and building local political constituencies to make sure charter cities are durable. If that sounds interesting to you, the best way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. That way, you're not only helping us, but you're helping them find something interesting and informative. Without further ado, here's Mark Lutter. So, you had a very interesting article recently about taking over the Presidio. What's the plan?
Sure. So, for those that don't know, the Presidio is a 1,500-acre park, I think a former U.S. Army or maybe Navy base. In the 90s, it was decommissioned, and in 1996, Congress passed a law called the Presidio Trust Act that established a trust to manage and develop the Presidio, and it is probably the most valuable federal land in the country, right? Like San Francisco real estate is probably like $3 to $5 million per acre in the less desirable parts, and in the more desirable parts, $20 million an acre plus. So Presidio probably rounds out to about $10 million an acre or more. Second, just in terms of San Francisco, right? It's the tech capital of America. It's arguably the tech capital of the world. And people matter. If you can have a lot more people in that area, that means more ideas bouncing off each other. That means more companies, more investments, right? More technology, more acceleration. So agglomeration matters. And if we can create more housing opportunity and job opportunities in San Francisco, which is one of the most important cities in the world, I think that's extremely important. More generally, right, about 2 years ago, Trump gave a short speech about freedom cities, where he says the U.S. should build more freedom cities, new cities on federal land with some degree of regulatory improvement. Given that SF focuses a lot on tech, but some of that tech has regulatory constraints in terms of drones, in terms of some areas of biotech, right? Like developing Presidio offers the opportunity not just to build a lot of new housing and commercial development, but also an improved regulatory system that can really pour gasoline on a lot of the innovation that's already happening in SF. There's kind of two elements to this, right? There's the Presidio Trust, which has a board. The president has the authority to fire the board and appoint a new board. I think 3 of the board members have to be from San Francisco or the Bay Area. The other 3 can be anywhere. And the last board member is the Secretary of the Interior. So he can fire the board and appoint a new board that is more pro-development. The Presidio Trust Act, kind of, if you look at the specific language, it says they need to develop the Presidio, but they also need to like preserve nature and natural beauty. And so could you develop all of the Presidio? Like, no, that's probably not. It's probably kind of a bad reading of the statute. Developing 10, 15, maybe even 20% of the Presidio, the areas that aren't currently being highly used, allows you to preserve nature as well as creating a lot of housing opportunity. Let's see if I remember. I think at Paris level density, all of the Presidio, that's about 120,000 people. Right. So that's a 15, 20% increase in the population of San Francisco. If you have higher level density, obviously that's bigger. So this is like a non-trivial amount of housing. Let's say you're developing 10%, that's 150 acres. Can be a decent chunk of housing. So that's one element, right? Like the president has unilateral authority to fire the board, appoint a new board that will have the right to develop part of the Presidio. The other element is this Freedom Cities element, where what we're working on is legislation that would then allow for developers on federal land or on private land to come to the government and ask for exemptions from specific federal regulations. So let's say you want to test drones out of line of sight. Let's say you want like right to try medicine. Let's say you want to build a nuclear reactor, and do you think the NRC is going to be too slow? This the Freedom Cities legislation would allow case by case opt out, and some of those cases could be very valuable in the Presidio, where you already have a very high density of talent and investors.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think that there's two cases that I've read from you or from other, Charter City, Freedom City advocates. One is based on just kind of quantity, right? We need to build the houses. There's lots of kind of NIMBY regulation that gets in the way. And one is a lot more enterprise focused, right? We want better drone regulation. We want better drug regulation. And this is an area to do the experimentation. And I think you mentioned both of those in terms of the Presidio, but is there one that kind of takes precedence here?
It depends on like the magnitude, but I would probably say housing probably takes a bit of precedence over deregulation. In most just because the Bay Area has very high housing prices, and having more people, allowing more talent to be there, seems like it can be very valuable for increased innovation. And then, two, if you think about some of the current regulatory blockers, for example, energy, right? You don't want to build, even if you have legal permitting, right? You probably want to build a nuclear plant in Nevada or Wyoming and not in Presidio. The advantage of building in Presidio is relatively low, and you probably wouldn't want to pay the high housing prices anyway. For drones, 1,500 acres might not be enough space to test. And then, two, you're already kind of close to the flight paths of both the Oakland as well as the San Francisco airport. And so your ability to test drones out of line of sight is probably a lot more limited than other locations. You might be able to do some biotech stuff, and that is probably the most bullish case for regulatory autonomy for Presidio. But I don't know exactly what, like, the biotech stuff feels a little bit less well defined than like drones and energy. So I think I'm open to that, but like the case for just building a lot of new housing feels very obvious and strong. So I would probably just focus on that. Like if you're in the middle of the Nevada desert, then you don't want to do a bunch of housing, right? The value of housing there is basically zero. But like San Francisco is one of the most housing constrained places in the world, and so unlocking that housing is just super high value.
Yeah, and I think you draw the analogy to Shenzhen, right? Which is something that, some journalists took issue with. But you draw the analogy to Shenzhen. What happened in Shenzhen and why is it important?
Sure. So Shenzhen is arguably the one of the most important things for Chinese economic development. Basically, in 1980, Deng Xiaoping, who took power after Mao died, realized that they couldn't be full communists anymore. And so they needed to allow a little bit of markets, a little bit of investment, of private sector development. Right, a famous Deng Xiaoping quote is "Crossing the river by feeling." You need to get across. You don't know exactly how you're going to do it, but like you need to figure it out. The other one is right. Doesn't matter what color a mouse is, as long as or it doesn't matter what color a cat is, as long as it catches the mouse. So kind of like this ideology neutral perspective, right? And in a country as large and complex as China, especially when you have a lot of existing stakeholder groups that might be opposed to change, you need to be very careful about where you implement that change. So, right, Shanghai is the traditional commercial center of of China, and they did not implement the reforms in Shanghai because, right, was an existing like semi-capitalist base there that they did not want to empower. So they chose Shenzhen and three other sites, mostly in the southeast, um, to create special economic zones. And these are much more expansive than what most people think about special economic zones. Like your standard special economic zone is like a few acres, it'll have tax breaks, and that's it. And maybe like an industrial park, right? Shenzhen was over 300 square kilometers. Uh, they delegated basically all authority except for a handful of things: post office, national defense, and monetary policy to the Shenzhen government. So it was very large. It had a very large amount of delegated authority, and then it was also in a ideal location. Right, proximity to Hong Kong meant that one, there were easy capital flows from Hong Kong as well as knowledge transfer, because many of the people in Hong Kong had previously escaped from Shenzhen or the surrounding region. So this allowed for very easy, like the first 17 years of Shenzhen's existence, from 80 till 97, something like 90% of foreign direct investment came through Hong Kong. Shenzhen pioneered labor markets in China. They pioneered land markets. They pioneered, well, we're arguably Shanghai. Like there's an argument, but Shenzhen played an important role in pioneering capital markets in China. And this was largely a bottom up discovery process, right? So what would happen is the labor market story is interesting, right? You had some basically Hong Kong businessmen that wanted to invest in a hotel. So they invested in the hotel, and there were Chinese women working for the hotel. The Chinese women were like, "Look, we don't want to wear makeup, and we don't want to change the sheets more than once a week because that's capitalist bullshit." And the investors were like, "Okay, well, we will give you money to do these things, and if you don't do these things, then like we can fire you or you can leave with a month's notice." And like that's the first labor market, or at least government respected labor market in modern China. And so, because Shenzhen was successful in '84, China created a bunch more zones. In '88, they created a bunch more zones. And right, this model of basically special economic zones plus urbanization spread throughout the rest of China, that played a really critical role in Chinese economic development. And then the other kind of part of this analogy is right, like Shenzhen is part of the what's sometimes described as the Bay Area in China, which is Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Macau. It's this large kind of bay. And obviously, San Francisco is sometimes the Bay Area. And so it's drawing this analogy to these two mega cities, or two very important cities. Shenzhen is the kind of it's arguably the tech capital of China, or at least like the industrial capital. They manufacture a lot of products there. The Bay
Yes,
Area is the
extremely important in Chinese AI hardware and hardware more generally. Lots of like Huawei fabs, research centers there.
Yeah, and so San Francisco and the Bay Area in the U.S. is obviously the center of tech in the U.S., though a little bit less manufacturing heavy, obviously a lot more software heavy. So, and then like if you look at, in addition to Shenzhen in China, right, it's next to Hong Kong, which is a proto charter city in some margin, right? It was governed by the British until 1997. It was very successful in terms of wealth creation, in terms of development. You have Macau, which was governed by the Portuguese. So you have these like kind of competing jurisdictions with different laws that really played a very important role not only in their own development but China's broader development. And that's kind of another analogy to draw attention to, right? If you have this jurisdiction in the Bay Area that's governed by the federal government, that's much easier to build things. It's much easier to not just physical infrastructure, but also companies, also new products because of a more streamlined regulatory environment, right? That plays not just a role in the immediate innovation, but also hopefully inspiring San Francisco to get their act together a little bit more. Like maybe San Francisco then liberalizes housing because they need to compete a little bit more with Presidio. Maybe they empower the police so that there's not human feces on some of the streets, right? And so this kind of competitive governance aspect, when you have a handful of jurisdictions competing in a relatively small environment, kind of plays this additional role that I think there are some lessons to be drawn from Shenzhen and the Bay Area in China.
Yeah, and it presents this really fascinating theory of change, right? Because I think that a lot of people have been complaining that the way political change happens is way too national. It's like a big national debate, everyone gets involved, and it becomes a sort of, maybe based on elections, but ultimately something that's based on convention or just based on opinion or hot takes. And this is a very different way of approaching, political change, right? Deng Xiaoping was going through a moment of unconfidence in the legacy system of communism with Chinese style characteristics. And he was just opening, he didn't say we're going to have a big national debate about, whether we're communist. But we had these incremental reforms, right? We had these reforms that, started small and then, as you say, generalized to more parts of Chinese society. I know we've talked about this in the past, but like, is this a general example of kind of change of institutions? And what other examples are there in history?
Yeah, so I think this is part of why I started the Charter Cities Institute is I grew up in libertarian circles, and the libertarian theory of social change is basically it's inspired from Hayek with an essay Socialism and the Intellectuals, where he looks at why socialism spread, and he's like, look, socialism spread because all the intellectuals, which he defines as secondhand dealers of ideas. So think journalists, like lawyers, op-ed writers, etc. Not the people coming up with new ideas, but the people who would proliferate them, like news anchors. All of them got convinced of socialism, and then once they got convinced of socialism, right, socialism would take power in these places. And so most like standard libertarian approach is basically looking at this essay and saying, okay, uh, that's how libertarians need to win. We need to convince all of the secondhand dealers of ideas that we are correct, and then like you have libertarian society. And I was always very skeptical of that. I mean, for several reasons. One, like just if you read Hayek's essay, he was being descriptive, not proscriptive, right? Saying this is how socialism took over, and it's much easier in some ways to sell socialism because it's like you get free stuff than it is to sell like uh, free markets where it's you have to work. Another element is that mediating societal institutions have changed a lot since Hayek wrote the essay in the 40s. Right? Like we went through a period of cable news dominating, now we're in the period of internet dominating. And as we've seen with the most recent election, right, like a lot of these secondhand dealers and ideas have been basically like cut out of the picture by a n like one to n mechanism, which is basically like Twitter, where you can kind of post your thoughts and have them be consumed by everyone. And the secondhand dealers of ideas pick up the thoughts on Twitter and republish it in their own medium. We're seeing a huge disruption in how ideas spread. And so the theory behind charter cities was kind of several fold. One, it is oftentimes easier to get buy in for deep reforms in an area that nobody cares about than in an area that people do care about. We go back to the example of Shenzhen, right?
Right,
They
it
had a
wasn't Shanghai.
yeah, it wasn't Shanghai because that was the traditional commercial center of China. Two is if you create a self-interested group you that benefits from that liberalization, you reverse the logic of collective action. Right? So typically the logic of collective action is used to justify why bad rules are passed and stay in place. But if you create like figure out a way for a single group to benefit from economic liberalization, then you have this kind of built-in incentive replication mechanism that does not exist in other forms of social change. And there are real world examples of this, right? There's China with a bunch of special economic zones being passed after Shenzhen. There, if you look at financial centers in the Middle East and abroad, right, the first one was the Dubai International Financial Center. Now there's Abu Dhabi. Now there's Qatar. There's one in Kazakhstan. There's one in Egypt. They're looking at there's one that they're working on in Rwanda. Um, so there is a very clear kind of mechanism for social change when you have a new jurisdiction that is successful that can be replicated relatively quickly. And so I do think if you look right, America has a long history of federalism. You have the Brandeis quote that federalism is a laboratory for democracy. We've seen a lot of federalism like basically be weakened in the last like 50 to 70 years because the federal government has taken a lot more authority, which basically limits the ability of states in terms of their freedom of action. And I see freedom cities as a way to hopefully return some of that freedom of action, hopefully can get the bipartisan support necessary for legislation that allows for much more experimentation on a local level, focusing on areas that do not have a lot of interest groups because they're unpopulated, because there isn't a lot of economic activity happening there that allows you to kind of figure out what deep reforms work. And then hopefully, once they work, kind of scale them up to embrace a much wider area to have kind of the biggest impact possible.
That's a really interesting point you make about federalism because going back to the Presidio example, I'm not actually sure if the problems in San Francisco are because of nationalization. I think there's both, right? But like the local housing laws and how San Francisco itself is run. If Presidio is run by like the same people in the local area, wouldn't it be like wouldn't it cause the same kind of problem? What is the Presidio like governance structure? Exactly. It's by this board that's like kind of from San Francisco, but not right. How does that relate to federalism? And is it really like taking from the local population, or is it changing the way things work in general?
Yeah, so the board, right, it's federal land, which basically means it's not subject to like local zoning and land use law. You might have been to a bar, the Interval in Fort Mason. They can serve 18-year-olds drinks because the 21-year-old drinking law is a state law, and the Interval is on federal land, and so they are not bound by state law. And so I'm mostly a pragmatist, right? I think there are a set of good policies. Generally, we should pursue those good policies, and sometimes it's better to pursue them at a local level, and sometimes it's better to pursue them at a national level, right? And so, if you look at most of the a lot of the challenges in San Francisco are currently self-inflicted, just like very high housing prices because they don't build new housing. Uh, High taxes, a government that's actively antagonistic towards technology, as well as very poor public services, including police. Um, and if you look at much of the YIMBY movement has been successful in part by taking housing out of the local authority and putting it at the state level authority. If you look at the history of nation states kind of came on the scene in part by crushing local authorities, local principalities. Right. If you look at Germany before unification, like every mile you went down the Rhine, you have to pay a different prince, a different like tax. Now, obviously, that's not conducive. So, nation states exist in part because they were effective at creating internal free trade zones that allowed for kind of more specialization and more innovation. And that was generally a good thing, right? Obviously, lots of challenges with the emergence of nation states in terms of nationalism, in terms of persecuting minorities, but internal free trade zones, like generally good. At the same time, right, the risk of empowering a kind of national government too much is always apparent. We're seeing this in the EU, with the EU being like just generally kind of the open market between the countries is good, but the EU's become kind of generally too pro regulation, too anti innovation. That's having like a lot of negative downstream impacts. You see this in the US with some one like size fits all regulations with that are kind of risky. So I think you have to like I don't know be pragmatic about what is the right level for decision making for what issue, right? Like in terms of brushing my teeth, that should be my decision, right? That should not be government decision, my decision. And so figuring out what is the right unit for decision making for different decisions, and hopefully, right, like, and then two, being aware of the I don't know competitive tension between these different units, and if one unit's swinging too far in one direction in terms of influence, figuring out how to create a counterbalancing force, whether below or above it, in terms of what the relevant governing level is.
Yeah, I think this debate is centrally important though, because the theory of change actually really matters. If there's just this kind of big convergence towards, federal governments and nation states, and those are kind of just misdirecting local governance, then the mere existence of more empowered local zones is a solution in itself, right? But if the problem is something else, if it's caused by something else that makes the local government of San Francisco equally bad, if not worse, then we need to start thinking about different factors when we're thinking about how are we designing this charter city. Like, what steps are you thinking about when it comes to just how the Presidio is going to be run and avoiding making it just another copy of SF?
Yeah, I'm not the one designing the Presidio. Like the new, I'm not hiring the new trust, the new board members, right? Like I wrote an article about it. I hope it happens. Like if
Great
I were,
article.
I can say like I guess how I think about it and what I would do if I were in that position. But like I think you're right, right? Are you trying to get out of federal regulation or are you trying to get out of local regulation, right? Zoning and land use is local. And if you're optimizing for that, you have to think through a different set of kind of constraints. One set of constraints is, at least in Presidio, right? Are you going to trigger lawsuits? And if so, how strong are those lawsuits going to be? Because the Presidio Trust Act says like you need to preserve natural beauty. And then two, Presidio is a much loved park in San Francisco. And three, there's a lot of rich people in San Francisco that are going to be more than happy to sue the Trump administration. So, like, how do you try to develop this in a way that minimizes the risk of lawsuit, or if there are lawsuits, make sure that they can't get an injunction to stop? Because you need to get things developed basically within 4 years when it might flip to a Democratic administration who might fire all the board members. right? So you've got a somewhat limited time window for a high capex project with a lot of hostile actors. Two is right. The primary value add is zoning and land use. So you probably want to keep the land inside the federal government, which means you don't sell the land. Maybe you get a developer that says, "I want 10 acres to build X." You toss the land into like an SPV. They bring capital to SPV, but legally the land stays part of the federal government, so it's still exempt from local zoning and land use. Right. Three is if you're going to have a large population there, you need to coordinate with the city of San Francisco in terms of infrastructure, right? Like road accessibility, electricity, water, etc. It probably doesn't make sense to build out like electricity and water provision yourself until you hit a certain critical mass, if not ever, because you can tap into the SF grid and water and figuring out how you do that. Because the San Francisco government, if they were very hostile, could kind of prevent all of those things from happening. And so, from the legislative level, right, this is one of the things that we've been thinking about internally. Is like one of the large benefits of Freedom Cities is allowing more housing in blue states, mostly blue coastal states, right? The flip side is that could make it difficult to get the necessary Democratic support to pass the bill. And the current approach is that we're thinking of is allowing right private land to become a freedom city, and maybe the government buys it and then it's leased back to the private owner. However, the governor of the relevant state where it's doing business in has like a 90-day veto right. So if somebody proposes like I want to turn all this land into government land to opt out of local zoning, the governor of the state has a veto right of that. So that forces you to kind of negotiate with the governor to make sure that what you are proposing is something that can keep a functional political equilibrium that I think we think is necessary to really get this law passed.
Yeah, how are Democrats thinking about this? Because I can imagine a kind of like Nikki Haley administration or something where Democrats are willing to cooperate. And like there's a lot of YIMBY Democrats, right? But how are they thinking about this now? How are they thinking about the Freedom Cities now under Trump?
So I'm not sure they're thinking about it that much. There's one Democrat, Jake Alkenclaus, who recently did a podcast with Ezra Klein, where he proposed kind of charter cities in the U.S. He's from Massachusetts, and he discovered this idea independently. Right, he's kind of in and around the progress studies, abundance conversations, and I think given the current, let's call it, lack of direction in the Democratic Party, he's trying to position himself as big ideas, as like we want to build things, which I think is great. When I spoke with him, he mentioned that he wasn't even aware that Trump proposed it, but he was thinking along fairly similar lines. He's from Massachusetts. He recommended there's two military bases or former military bases in Massachusetts that could be developed, and so he's a YIMBY. He's thinking about this element, and I suspect that will be similar lines to like the kind of pro progress, pro abundance, pro innovation Dems, which I don't know might be 20, 30% of the Dems in Congress. I don't know really how the other Dems think, right? We're still in early stages of this. Currently, what we're working on is a outline to draft legislation that we want to shop around to get feedback on. Once we get feedback on the outline to draft legislation, right, then we can hire a firm to come up with that draft legislation and figure out who the best champions in the House and Senate to propose this are to make this as likely to pass as possible. But yeah, right now we haven't, other than like local California newspapers hating on us because of the Presidio thing, we haven't really gotten substantive feedback from Dems about what their interest in Freedom Cities is.
Yeah, one of the problems I've encountered, and I don't do any work on like Freedom City stuff or anything like that, but one of the problems I've encountered on AI is that there actually are, like you said, a lot of abundance, like pro economic growth, pro YIMBY Democrats, but they're just not in the mood to cooperate right now. Like when you speak to a lot of Democratic representatives or their offices, they'll I think they'll be really clear and say if it weren't for a lot of the stuff Trump is doing, we'd be really happy to cooperate on a lot of these things. Like I said, like in a hypothetical Nikki Haley administration. But right now, like just because of the kind of national mood, they want to just block everything. Even things that, they might otherwise be like very happy to support theoretically. Are you encountering that problem?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we haven't had those conversations yet, so I don't know. I think that strikes me as something that is quite plausible. Obviously, this is kind of a unique political moment, and it's quite plausible that people that otherwise would be supportive just decide not to because of their frustration with the Trump administration. So perhaps we'll encounter that problem in the next month or two as we start doing more legislative outreach. But we have not encountered that problem as of yet, just given that we haven't engaged Democrats too much. One piece of advice we did get was to not put the kind of task force, the Freedom Cities task force, in the White House because Democrats would not want to empower Trump. So now we're thinking about like an independent agency or government sponsored entity as the legal mechanism to help create Freedom Cities. And maybe that makes it a little bit more palatable to Dems. Maybe you allow right 2 Dem seats, 2 R seats, and then the president gets the fifth seat. Like a lot of this stuff we can come up with different mechanisms for, but it's kind of all speculation until the rubber meets the road and we actually get feedback from relevant Congress members to get a sense of right where they stand and what they would be interested in voting for.
That's fair enough. And it touches upon a really important point that you made a few times now, which is the political constituencies, right? Let's kind of step back and look at the Charter Cities Institute, the Charter Cities idea as a whole. What lessons have you learned about forming and preserving political constituencies just like literally across the world?
The original bet with the Charter Cities Institute was that there were kind of these different constituencies, namely like development community, investors, governments, new city builders, service providers that we could bring together and get them to support charter cities. And that did not work out entirely as we hoped. The development community is like pretty conservative. They basically get pots of money from like governments plus very large foundations. They're mostly averse to new ideas, and we never really had much success engaging them. Right, governments, especially in emerging markets, tend to be pretty capital and capability constrained. The engagement there was a bit slow. Like it's very hard to sell like big new idea that requires multi-stakeholder engagement. We have found that once we start proposing specific projects on a local level, things move a little bit more quickly. But there it can be challenging as right we just run into bureaucracy. So one example is in Zanzibar, we met with the president to propose turning an existing special economic zone, like modernizing the administration of the zone, developing it. We had a very strong local partner that had already built a town. We meet the president. The president says, "This is my dream," and then like the bureaucracy just slows everything down. And we've had that experience also once working in the Caribbean. I guess maybe another way to frame this is like local partners matter a lot. So where we've seen the most kind of success in India recently, it's because there is a local partner that has passed legislation to create a 30,000 hectare special economic zone in Uttar Pradesh outside of Delhi, right? And these are a bunch of economists, so right, they think like me, they know read a lot of the same people, right? They know some of the same people, so there's very low friction in communication. Um, they're kind of doing what we would do if we were in India. So they're already like kind of pretty advanced, but they were able to build out these relationships because of their previous careers, because they're Indian in a way that it would take years for us to do if we were ever able to do it at all. And so their kind of success in getting legislation passed and coordinating with the relevant local parties, including government, like state government, national government, chatting with private conglomerates that can help develop the SEZ, chatting with manufacturers who might want to locate there, right? Like just gives them a way to push things that we would not we would struggle to do ourselves. We're seeing this also in Central Asia where we have a partner that's like wants our help at a very high level in terms of like thinking through strategy, thinking through governance, thinking through partnerships, but they have the relationships to go talk to the governments and right get things moving. And as we're seeing, we are currently spinning off a company to do basically large scale urban expansion. So think large suburban developments in Africa at a low price point, right? Relatively limited autonomy, but just like, can we get very large suburbs right? Maybe if we get those right, we can go back to the government and ask for a little bit more authority at the municipal level. And here, what we're seeing is, yeah, the partners matter a lot. And then two, just like having a very clear value proposition. What is it we are doing? And at least in the urban expansion, we have a guy who has done urban expansion in a lot of places with municipal governments. So we kind of have a plan that we're just adjusting for private kind of sector development rather than public sector development. But like functionally, it's very similar. So I guess the general lessons are, yeah, I mean, political coalition building is really hard. You have to be patient. Good local partners are extremely important, and being very clear about what the kind of value proposition that you bring in is critical.
What makes those relationships durable? Like we can kind of break it out into categories. There are developers, there are like people with an economic interest, there are the intellectuals, people who have a philosophical interest or have their reputation based on promoting an idea. You know, you mentioned some economists, right? There are probably other examples of people who are invested in other ways, maybe someone who has direct political power to kind of supervise the economic zone. So, what factors in terms of power or in terms of interest or in terms of ties make for a strong political constituency to support a charter city?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be on a case by case basis, but I think it's yeah, you need to align interests of the local government with the city. And so typically this starts with the government. Right? If you don't get government buy-in, you're not going to get anything else. And building up like other buy-in as a lever to get government buy-in is just like very time consuming and uncertain. It doesn't make sense in the vast majority of cases. So like I guess the
Always the
sequence,
government first.
yeah, that I wouldn't say always, but like 90%, 95% of the time, government first. Go to government, figure out what they want, like what are their national narratives, what like so India, for example, which I mentioned, they have special economic zone legislation from 20 years ago, and it didn't really work. And so part of the challenge is right, how do we overcome this perception of why this first version didn't work, why this version is different? Another challenge in India is right, the local population is very skeptical of large companies, especially those that try to acquire land. Right, there's kind of a built-up immune system against like large scale land acquisition, where if you're doing a zone, right, that's important. So how do you actually develop a plan to agglomerate, get a bunch of land in a way that you're not violating the rights of the local population? And the governments are smart; they realize these things. In the Caribbean, the country we're working with, they feel as though it's kind of a foreign enclave. There, kind of the question is, okay, how do we come up with a proposition that creates the business environment that makes it competitive, while at the same time, like working with the government, so they don't see this as a foreign enclave, they don't see it as a threat to their sovereignty, but really as a kind of extension of their sovereignty and an empowerment of their citizens. So I think it's very important to one understand what the internal narrative of the country is, and how do you plug into that internal narrative and like figure out what they're worried about, adequately address their concerns, and make it so you're empowering the things that they already want to do rather than taking away their control. Once you have that done, right, the other risk is right in countries where there are shifts in power between political parties, as we're seeing in Honduras, that can be very high risk for charter cities. And you can kind of look at different parts of the world. Latin America is especially difficult because the left wing tend to be like literal communists and the right wing tend to be like proto fascists, right? And so when you have such wide swings in political ideology between parties, that's more difficult than other parts of the world where it might be like populist versus different kind of populist, or the ideology might not be as pronounced. So let's say, all right, you get government buy-in, or you also want to align the incentives with government. So that's like making government benefit from like revenue streams of the project, and maybe not just like government money goes into general fund, but money goes into specific pockets in government. Where like one is the army, one is the education, one is the police, right? One is the pensions. And if it's going into specific pockets, that's better than general funds because then those specific pockets have a vested interest in the continued success of the project. Right? Like other things you could do along those lines is publicly list the project on a local stock exchange, where if you publicly list it on the stock exchange, right, local pension funds will probably buy in, and pension funds tend to wield political power. Understanding your place and your role is important. Many of these countries are have a history of colonization and are wary of Americans, Europeans kind of coming in and telling them what to do. So having a bit of humility, having a bit of understanding, having kind of actually being friendly, building out relationships with people, being very clear about what your intentions are and communicating that effectively, um, I think is very important. That can help how you get some of the intellectuals, local intellectuals supportive, is by not creating a project for the other, but creating a project for them where they can participate, where they come to events. So, one example in Zanzibar, we're hosting for a second time Zanzalu, Zanzalu. Check it out, zanzalu.org. But the idea, some of your listeners might have heard of Zuzalu, where
Yep.
Vitalik, like almost 2 years ago, organized Zuzalu in Montenegro. It was a 2 month, like quote unquote, pop up, 200 people for 2 months with 100, 200 people coming in and out every week. And so we were inspired by that to do that for 1 month in Zanzibar, get some full time residents, get some people coming in and out. And there we've made a very strong focus on the local community. So last year, for example, we bussed in some kids from the State University of Zanzibar, right? We're partnering with the Zanzibar Startup Association. We've got some of the organizers are on the ground in Zanzibar doing events every month or two. We're also partnering with some folks in Dar es Salaam, the nearby city in Tanzania, as well as Nairobi, the nearby city in Kenya, to figure out, like, all right, how do we actually build these relationships? How do we create a ground game? How do we demonstrate that we're not just trying to create something, build something for foreigners by not doing that, by actually doing the work and doing the thing and creating kind of a community and quote unquote products that locals enjoy, that they feel a part of, that they benefit from, and they value. And there's no easy way around that other than like actually get rolling your sleeves up and doing the work. So none of this is like, I don't know, rocket science, but to build that political coalition, it requires having a vision, like actually being there, articulating that vision, and creating meaningful partnerships with the locals on the ground where they see how they benefit. And it's like, I don't know, like startups, right? Like, what do you need for a good startup? You need to build a product that people want, right? Like, how do you
Yes.
build a coalition, local coalition? Like, go talk to people and build things that they want. And the hard part is actually doing it. But that's the kind of general animating principle.
Yeah, there's a debate now over international development and USAID and the State Department. Some historically on the left, now more on the right, would argue that it's kind of counterproductive and has, created this hostility because Americans are trying to kind of impose their project on others. What would a functional USAID or kind of State Department grant making program do, either in general or relation to charter cities?
I guess this depends on what the goal of U.S. aid is, right? There's like two potential goals. There's one goal, the cynical goal is U.S. aid exists to advance American interests and prop up friendly governments. There's the, I don't know, humanitarian goal, which is like U.S. aid exists to help people around the world. And obviously, as in most circumstances, there's both elements have both parts have an element of truth, right? PEPFAR did not really advance American interests, but like was saving lives at a pretty good cost effectiveness ratio. And other programs that USAID were running were very clearly kind of influence operations to build up support. I think both of those things are valuable, right? The U.S. government should promote our interests abroad, and I don't know if USAID is the right mechanism to do that, but like that can involve promoting civil society and promoting parts of government and parts of business in a way around the world in a way that are friendly to American interests. And I think there's also an argument for the humanitarian role, especially if we're able to save lives at a relatively low cost. That's a good thing that we should do in some cases. As to, I guess, the question, like, what is the, I don't know, best world version of U.S. aid or foreign aid? So this is, I don't know, hard to know. It's a big question. I think there's some additional elements that are kind of worth discussing perhaps before that. So if you look around the world, like the places that have been most successful, like got there without aid. Japan, China, South Korea, like the Asian tigers generally are rich not because of aid, but because of some internal process that allowed them to accumulate capital and become wealthy. On the other hand, global health has generally been very effective, right? If you look at even in very poor countries today, life expectancy tends to be quite good, especially if you look at compared to years past. So global health has been like very effective in extending life. Global development has been pretty ineffective about accelerating economic growth. And then you have the additional challenge where, right, like economic global development has can have a distorting impact on countries. And so some countries, for example, have more than 50% of the country's revenue is from foreign aid. And when that happens, the government is often more responsive to the donors than to their own citizens. Right? The entire kind of idea of democratic government is that governments are responsive to taxpayers because they pay taxes. That creates like a positive feedback loop to make good decisions. And when governments are more responsive to foreign bodies than their own citizens, right, that means that they're perhaps not solving the relevant problems on the ground and instead solving problems for foreigners. You see
Yeah, for like the
additional
ivory tower.
Yeah, you see additional market distortions in some emerging markets where recent graduates only work for NGOs that are very unproductive but pay high salaries. So NGOs basically distort local labor markets where the most talented locals, if they don't move abroad, end up working in low productivity jobs that are high status and high pay. Best case scenario, US aid look like moving forward? The main question, I think, is what does the US want the world to look like moving forward? And here we're seeing obviously a deep disruption of the old system, but there isn't a very clear new vision put forward. And so I think until you really figure out what that looks like, right, you can think of elements, I don't know, build support against China, I don't know, spread American values, some degree of like stability to avoid regional wars and terrorism, some elements of that. I think the one thing that we're considering and thinking about at the Charter Cities Institute is how charter cities can play a role in American foreign policy. And functionally, what that would mean is, right, like the US government encouraging countries to create legal frameworks, offering technical support, perhaps offering like capital for charter city projects. This can be built around kind of resource extraction or processing or manufacturing as a way to secure supply chains in ways that are more easy to be monitored by the government. The president prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is currently engaged in a I don't know pseudo war with Rwanda, offered like a substantial amount of mineral rights to the U.S. in exchange for the U.S. support. Um, and it's unclear like what this would mean in practice. Like, would the U.S. just have a revenue share agreement with the government? The government would split revenue with the U.S. Uh, with the U.S., but that doesn't really solve our supply chain problems, where most of the cobalt that's extracted gets sent to China to process. So maybe we want to build right extraction in DRC plus processing, and what are the requirements for that? If you're doing that, like you're talking about urban development with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and maybe you want to have also like a streamlined governance process for there and some additional right like protections for workers and residents in that place. And at that point, you're talking about something that's approximating a charter city. So I think there is an avenue for charter cities to be a element of a kind of reimagined USA US foreign engagement that allows us being the US to secure supply chains, to have resource extraction, promote American values in a way that kind of USA might not have been doing as effectively as they could have.
That's interesting because, in some ways, the problem charter cities face and the problem they're trying to solve in this case is the same problem, right? Which is the problem of foreign governments, possibly politically unstable ones, trying to make firm commitments. And if you look at a case like Honduras, I think from one of your other podcast interviews, you talked about the pre existing political problems there, that they were already facing these legitimacy challenges, and that made it difficult for it to create, a real firm commitment. I don't really see how this solves the kind of circle, right? It seems like a circular problem where if you want to create a charter city for them to have a firmer commitment, but they can't make a firm commitment to a charter city unless they already have the ability to make firm commitments. Do you know what I mean? How do you solve that problem?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of the central tension in charter cities. It's the countries that would benefit most from a charter city benefit because of a like some degree of poor governance and some inability to make long-term commitments. But that inability to make long-term commitments also makes it very difficult to commit to a charter city, right? If they were able to have rule of law and good governance and open markets, they probably wouldn't need a charter city. That being said, right, like this is the central tension, but also as we discussed earlier during this conversation, right, like Shenzhen exists, Dubai exists. There are examples of like historically Venice exists.
The interesting thing with Shenzhen is that it was done like internally, right? It was done by the
Sure,
government of China.
sure, but like some of these projects, like you've got the Paul Romer model where you have a foreign guarantor come in, and right the Honduras, right, it was done by the government of Honduras, right? They allowed private companies to go make developments. The law in Honduras, there's no foreign guarantor, and even if you look at Shenzhen, Deng Xiaoping did his famous southern tour, I think in like 92, 93, where he basically needed to build up political support. This was after he retired as premier, but he needed to build up political support to save Shenzhen because the conservative hardliners in the government wanted to basically crack down on Shenzhen. So Deng Xiaoping had to go and do like this whole southern tour to basically be like, look, guys, like this liberalization strategy is working. The special economic zones are working. They've created a lot of wealth. This is good. And he was through that tour, he was able to build up enough political support to maintain the relative autonomy of Shenzhen and similar special economic zones. So it's not like the outcome of Shenzhen and the other SEZs in China was a foregone conclusion, right? There was a risk of expropriation. There was a risk of, I mean, maybe not expropriation, but there was a risk of government crackdown on the concessions, on the autonomy that the local jurisdictions had. So you're never fully out of that risk, whether you've got a foreign guarantor or a local guarantor, right? This kind of goes back to your previous question of how do you align incentives, right? How do you build up relationships with the relevant political parties, with the local business people, with the local population? And this is just going to be a very case by case basis, right? In India, for example, I'm not really worried about like the special economic zone law. It's been passed. India has enough rule of law that it's unlikely they're gonna like just kill it outright. Like the main risk there is just execution risk. Like, can we establish the zone in a way that creates a lot of jobs? In Central Asia, there is the risk of government changing their mind. We've also got like Russia, 300, 800 pound gorilla to the north that sometimes kind of does aggressive things. I don't really know how to account for that risk. The in country risk, I think you can account for by making sure the government and relevant local elites benefit, but the risk from Russia, I don't know how you account for. And so a lot of this is just, right, there are examples of very large capital intensive projects. There are examples of charter cities or proto charter cities, even in like living memory. So these things like do and can exist. The question is, what is the set of initial conditions that allow you to put all the ingredients together in the right way to have an outcome that's kind of materially different from the alternative and justifies the time and effort that goes into it. And on that margin, it's very hard to find those opportunities, but they do exist. And with like the right amount of elbow grease, I think they can scale up and be very impactful.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think a big operational question is, in the case of Prospera, you had outside investors, and then you had the Honduran law providing guarantees to the outside investors, but it wasn't with the US government, right? So, how would things have played differently if the US government were involved, and should the US government be more involved with brokering charter city deals?
If the U.S. government supported it from the beginning, probably would have been more secure. At the same time, it might not have existed because they might not have been able to get the internal political buy-in. I'm sympathetic to the U.S. government supporting charter city deals. I think it has to be done in a the right manner. Right, there's a long history of kind of the U.S. or other governments imposing their will in emerging markets with like negative outcomes and building up like a strong local opposition. But the U.S. government, I think, also does a lot of good work in other countries in terms of stabilization, opening markets, creating more competitiveness. Everybody kind of hates the Washington Consensus now, but the Washington Consensus was like generally a good thing. Bill Easterly's written kind of a few papers on that look at like what the outcomes were in countries that received those treatments versus countries that didn't. And so like how do you do this? Maybe it's a U.S. program that's kind of has some carrots, maybe some sticks as well, just in terms of like increased foreign investment, access to preferential trade guarantees if charter cities are constructed under certain conditions, and allows countries then to make their own decision about whether they're interested in entering this program with the U.S. or they're interested in kind of keeping the status quo the same.
To try to move towards a kind of unified theory of everything we've talked about, how should the US go about thinking about if it is involved, how should it go about thinking about the political constituencies? I think you're absolutely right that there's been certainly bad examples of this in the past, and there are there have been positive examples as well. And the question is, with regards to charter cities, how can we essentially, act strategically to guarantee those kinds of development rights without creating the backlash and making sure people are satisfied? Like, what does that look like on an execution level?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you mentioned the U.S., like the other question is that, that we unfortunately have to ask now, like, is the U.S. a reliable counterparty? And right now, it's not obvious, right? Like, we're seeing a great disruption in activity. Maybe this disruption will take like the end of the Trump admin another 3 4 years, and there'll be a new normal, and everything kind of settles this down. Or maybe we'll see this kind of back and forth with Democratic and Republican administrations, where they just kind of tear down what the other party built and try to build up a new program that has a limited shelf life until the next election, right? And given that charter cities are like 30-year plus time commitments, kind of the question is, what does that look like? So, assuming the U.S. government is able and willing to make these long-term commitments, I think right the U.S. government in most cases is a big enough whale that their involvement like kind of is sufficient to outweigh a lot of local political concerns. Not to say that the U.S. government can impose their will, but the U.S. government coming and saying like, "Hey, we want to do X, and we attach Y dollars if you do X," kind of forces the local elite to say, "Okay, yes, we want X, we want those Y dollars, we want X," and that's enough of a carrot that the local elite just gets in line. Right, the kind of bigger of a whale you are, or the more negotiating leverage you have. And right, me, I'm not a very big whale, so when I'm talking with governments, I have to be very considerate of all of these things. But if you're the U.S. government and you've got like credit lines of billions, tens of billions of dollars, right? You can go and say, "I want X, Y, Z," and I don't know. You put out a contest. You say the U.S. wants to sponsor 10 charter cities around the world based on ABC criteria. Right? We want target populations of 1 million people. We want freedom of speech and rule of law, and we want to ensure that supply chains for critical goods, including like electronics, machine tools, whatever, are produced in these. And we want countries, we guarantee $10 billion of investment in each of these projects. And we encourage countries to come forward with proposals. Right? The US could do something like that. And then the US government doesn't really have to worry about local political coalitions because local political coalitions decide they want access to that capital and they'll arrange themselves as a way to access that capital.
Yeah, it's very hard to convince a man of something that his salary depends on him not believing, right? It's that kind of idea.
Yeah.
So you mentioned right now that the US is undergoing, I forget how you put it, but I would put it as the US is undergoing a bit of a regime change. There's some uncertainty about what foreign partnerships and foreign deals it's going to hold on to. And The question is that an obstacle for future charter cities? Is that something that makes it harder, or is the new role the U.S. is playing in some ways more supportive of charter cities?
I mean, the U.S. has not been supportive of charter cities at all, so I expect the new world to be slightly more supportive. Like the bigger framing I would go to, there's multiple elements to this, right? Like when empires recede, the periphery tends to become less economically and organizationally complex. If the US is an empire, and as we kind of pull back from our global role, you will see parts of the world where the US had a large presence and now has less of a presence become less economically and organizationally complex. I think the other element is, right, the US kind of in our role as global hegemon, along with kind of Soviet Union since World War II, has enforced a uniformity on local governing structures, where there was this expectation, right? Like liberal democracy is the end all be all. Even if you were an autocrat, you usually paid like lip service to liberal democracy, being like, oh, we're trying to get there. Oh, I'm actually like liberal, blah, blah, blah. And I think the US is no longer actively trying to play that role. And I think one of the consequences of this is going to be just a great increase in institutional diversity. And so we're already seeing this, right? Like with Bukele, with Milei, to a certain extent with like Orban, with Modi, where you've got these kind of political figures that are substantially outside of the mold in a way that was very rare like 10 and 20 years ago. And now you've got multiple of these figures kind of emerging. And so I see charter cities in that bucket, right? When institutional diversity increases, charter cities are not part of the current institutional set. They are part of a broader institutional set. So as institutional diversity increases, charter cities are more likely to be part of the kind of institutional set in existence. Just given like, right, Trump is talking about freedom cities, that this administration is much more open to big ideas, to new ideas than previous administrations. I expect them to be more open to charter cities as well. But a lot of this is going to play out over the next few years, depending on right what some of the final appointees are as kind of the administration gets a little bit more focused in the coming months as the kind of transition shakes out. Right, we'll get a much better idea of where charter cities fall on the priority list, how the new administration like impacts the development of charter cities abroad.
Yeah, so here is my pitch to you, okay? Our mutual friend Balaji has this idea of like history flowing in reverse, right? That for a long time, I think up until he says up until the 60s, history was flowing towards centralization of states and these massive nation states and then these massive international kind of multi-state, multi-nation conglomerates like the EU or even like the UN. And since the 60s, it's been flowing in reverse because of technology, because of culture. And now we're seeing, exactly what you're talking about. The big diversity in governing structures. And my idea, which I think differs from biology, is maybe the US should consider this kind of archipelago as something worth fostering, right? That the US should play an active role in kind of increasing the diversity of governments. What do you think of that strategy?
I think part of this is a question of are some of these dissident figures, how dissident are they? If you look at Millet, right, like his government cutting is very good. His rhetoric is like
Very spicy.
but if you look at a lot of his policies, they're actually kind of like standard IMF prescriptions. There are some substantial challenges with the current system, but the current system like generally works. We've seen massive alleviation of global poverty. We've seen reasonably consistent economic growth. We've seen like expanding trade networks. All these things are good. I don't know how sustainable that was over the long term, right? But obviously, we're at the point where the Trump administration is trying to change a lot of that. So yeah, like the U.S. government should act in ways that preserve its interests and the interests of the American people. And I think generally that means like trading partners. That means mitigating the risk of major wars that the U.S. will have the potential of getting pulled into. Uniformity, I think, is tends to be helpful for those things. This isn't to say, right, like if things are going bad in a region, like or in a country, the U.S. should support a candidate that can improve things. because that degree of stability, that degree of having richer trading partners tends to be good. But that's, I think, the framework I would use to kind of evaluate when the U.S. should support more dissident figures versus more mainstream figures.
One way to add a bit of detail to that is on specific issues, right? A lot of academics, like GMU's Robin Hanson, have complained about the homogeneity of drug laws, of research laws. I think we talked about this briefly, and Prospera, for example, had kind of more liberal, like classically liberal drug laws. You could do more experimentation. There was less bureaucracy, so on. Is that an issue where it's worth supporting? Where it's like you said, some of the conventional economics, development economics is right, but on something like drug laws, or are there any specifics where you think that's worth supporting?
Yeah, I mean, drug laws, I'd be inclined to say no, just because, like, if one country is
Oh,
able to
interesting.
produce drugs uh, freely, it just becomes a lot more easy for them to transport and sell them. For other things, like, well, I guess, let me specify. Now I'm talking about illicit drugs, right? Like, I think there is kind of
Oh,
value. Pharmaceuticals, I would agree the encouraging of support for different ones, but there it's unclear, right? If you look for pharmaceuticals, you need a very large market to justify like developing pharmaceuticals. There's only really like 3 or 4 markets large enough that make sense. It's basically Europe, China, and like Japan and the US. And I don't know how much leverage the US has in defining any of those drug laws. Like, I think the main challenge Prospera faces is like the set of innovations they have with like drugs and medical devices is just very limited, right? Because it has to be one single use. Because if it's chronic, people aren't going to fly down to Roatan every month or two to get treatment. And it has to be costly because there's a basically fixed cost of $2,000 to $3,000 after you pay for flight and housing, lodging down there of the treatment. And the question is, what is the set of this treatment that is like both costly and single use? How many treatments are there like that, and kind of how big is the market? And I don't have a clear idea of that, but it's a lot more limited than the number of treatments in a country like the U.S. That has a much larger population. So with things like energy, I think I would support, yeah, lots of different energy regs in terms of like nuclear. Like, I read Robin Hanson's point a little bit differently, right? Like, yes, there is a problem with homogeneity of regulations, but the way around that is not the U.S. supporting variance in regulations, right? Like, the homogeneity in regulations just comes from there naturally being a hegemon, right? It's an outcome, and even if this hegemon encourages diversity in local institutions, it's not going to get them, just because like the existence of a hegemon sort of forces on some margin uniformity of thought and like regulatory apparatuses. If the US really does want experiments, the best way to do that is to lead by example and to create mechanisms that allow for diversity of institutional regimes inside the US. And then our experts can go to other countries and say, look, we're trying these different regimes. Here's the data. Here's which ones work well. Here's which ones don't work well. That meme is then going to be very strong, and other countries are going to consider following that model. But I don't think the US just encouraging it without kind of positive action in other countries is going to have much impact.
Right. What makes a good charter city?
So the kind of inputs we look at when thinking about whether to engage a project or not, it tends to include just like location, who is the target population, uh, how much land is available, where is the nearest infrastructure, what is the talent level of the population, what is the kind of how are the capital markets in the host country, and like those are the inputs. The output is does the city grow at half a percent, even 2 percentage points higher than this area would have without the charter city, right? The ultimate metric of success of a charter city is greater economic growth. Um, and I think figuring out what the right inputs to that are, it's a balancing act. It's no like discrete formula. How we think about what will make for successful projects.
I heard on I think the same podcast that you started off as a George Mason economics student. What specifically were you most interested in at George Mason?
So I attended because I was reading a lot of Austrian economists. I wanted I did my PhD because I wanted to kind of engage in the great debate of ideas, and then realized the economics profession was not the best forum to do that in the current world. Uh, my PhD was on my dissertation was on charter cities, and I was interested in
So it's been
t-
a long, what, 20 more than that years?
oh no, I graduated like 8 years ago. I'm not that old.
Okay.
I
Oh,
took
I
five
thought the
years to
Charter Cities
finish.
Institute was very old. Okay, my bad.
No, CCI is 7 years old, and I guess 13 years if I include when I started graduate school. But my first few years of graduate school, I was not actively working on charter cities.
Yeah, that's a lot. Wow, CCI's gotten a lot done in a few years. Then that's amazing.
Yeah, thanks.
Circling back to internal charter cities planned by the U.S. in the U.S. is really interesting because there are, like we talked about, the Presidio. The Presidio, as you said, is more about housing, less about the regulatory experiments. But for example, with a lot of the industrial policy, right, and with the environmental laws, a big question is, have we just seriously gone wrong on how we approach regulation? Is there more of an active attempt to create these charter cities that are kind of more exempt from regulation and can engage in this like large scale industrial experimentation? One example I've heard, for example, is like the Starbase charter city. We're gonna completely change, rocketry laws and just see what Elon can do.
Yeah, so like what we're proposing with Freedom Cities would allow for projects to opt out of federal regulation on a case by case basis. So our goal with that is to create the broadest possible toolkit and allow different people, different entrepreneurs, different companies to experiment with what works the best. Maybe it's flying drones out of line of sight. Maybe it's building a bunch of nuclear energy for very cheap power so you can become competitive with metallurgy again. Maybe it's not having HIPAA so you can get a bunch of data on drugs that otherwise would be kind of illegal to acquire. I don't know what the best kind of mechanisms are. I've got kind of some guesses of where government regulations are most restrictive, but I think creating a process that allows experimentation, innovation to figure out what works the best is what I'm excited about. And so, as I said earlier, we're kind of working on a draft legislative outline, turn that into draft legislation, and going to make a hard legislative push next year. So, if folks are interested in learning about our approach to Freedom Cities or chatting with us, please reach out.
So you mentioned there that um, you can create some kind of exemption that just lets these charter cities opt out of federal laws. What kind of authority is that? Is that just through the legislation?
Yeah, so the legislation would be like basically say, here's a process that allows you to opt out case by case basis of federal laws. And like here we're having discussions about what the best mechanism is. Like, do we put this in the White House? Is this an independent agency? Is this a government sponsored entity? And we haven't quite figured out what the best mechanism is. So we're going to chat with folks and kind of get a sense of feedback to figure out what the best mechanism for the regulatory opt out system looks like.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how are you thinking about the kind of long term equilibrium of this, right? Let's say you can get some version of the legislation passed. How do you craft a domestic constituency that's durable, right? Like the same incentives apply in the US as abroad.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is Congress is very bad at passing legislation. So in the U.S., legislation tends to be quite sticky if you get it passed. Right? For Congress to repeal legislation, you have to paint a target on your back. Uh, Two is right, like if Freedom Cities can play a material role in increasing production and domestic supply chains for things in national defense, for consumer products, and if they help create a lot of wealth, then the beneficiaries of that wealth creation would have an interest in protecting Freedom Cities. So I'm a bit less concerned about regulatory stability in the U.S. just because one, Congress passes very few laws, and two, Freedom Cities should like tackle important national problems as well as create a lot of wealth, which hopefully creates a powerful enough domestic constituency to mitigate any risk of repealing.
In some ways, we're in a kind of revolutionary moment, right? At least in my opinion, one of the questions that I worry about is like, what if this is a fleeting moment, right? How do we make sure that we kind of make the most of the moment and kind of cement the political changes that we want to cement? Is there any way to use charter cities as a mechanism to, it can be in the US or anywhere, to turn kind of flash in the pan moments to more, sustainable economic development?
Sure. I mean, I think that's in some ways what happened in Shenzhen in China, right?
Oh,
Where
interesting.
they like if Shenzhen did not exist, I think Chinese economic development would look very different. Like maybe it would have been delayed 5 years. Maybe it would have been 6% a year instead of 10% a year. I don't know. Like the counterfactual is very hard to understand. Like I think China would have developed, but like the pace and the structure of the development and the timing, I think all could have been substantially different. This is the project we're working on in the Caribbean, right? Like what we think it is going to be very beneficial for the island, for the people, for the government. The highest impact is going to be potentially on the U.S. of having like a very effective functioning jurisdiction close to its shore that does not neatly fall into political categories. So if you look, right, like island nations have historically had a major institutional influence on nearby continents. So, right, like England had the Industrial Revolution, then France, Germany. Asia, it was Japan, then South Korea, right? Hong Kong, then China.
Yeah.
And so,
Singapore.
yeah. And so you do have these kind of sparks of innovation where if you capture and bottle it in the right way, have these like long lasting mimetic effects. And then two, also if you structure charter cities in the right way with the right domestic constituency, they tend to be more durable than kind of fleeting cultural moments might otherwise be. And so I do think charter cities can be part of this kind of social change, institutional change strategy where you take advantage of a moment, but you figure out how to kind of bake in that durability in a way that might not otherwise be the case, and can hopefully be a long term strategy for investment, job creation, economic development.
Yeah, that's a great place to end it, Mark. That was fantastic.
Great, thanks so much for having me on.